relationship between science and religion?
Well, I used to like Stephen Jay Gould's NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, that science and religion are largely two different enterprises. I no longer really hold that position, although I think we should be respectful of one another, and that engage in dialogue with people in the other area with respect and openness to conversation, so like you and I are doing here. But there are areas where religion does make empirical claims that can be challenged or at least tested, right? So if you have in a room a geologist that says the world is 4.6 billion years old, and you have a creationist that says the world is less than 10,000 years old, the answer is not halfway between them. You don't add them up and divide by 2 to get the correct answer. It's 3.1 billion years old. No, one of them is just wrong. And when religion has made empirical claims like that, they're inevitably wrong. Or if they're not wrong, they're kind of what we call filling in the God of the gaps. Just say, well, wherever you scientists can answer some particular question, we're going to say that's where God operates. Yeah, well, what are you going to do when the gap is filled by science? Why not take the position of my friend Francis Collins, who's head of the National Institutes of Health? He's a born-again evangelical Christian. He accepts all of evolution, geology, the old earth, and all the way up to, we evolved a moral sense because we're a social primate species. All this came about naturally, but guided by God. In other words, evolution is God's way of creating life forms. Diversity of life forms, natural selection, and so on, all operate all the way up to the search for meaning and even morality. You can make an argument, which I do in my book, The Moral Arc, right there. And but even so, this doesn't prove there's no God, and I'm not claiming that it does. What someone like Francis would say is, yes, that's what my God did. He used evolution to create life. In the same way that Newton argued, because after Newton published his great work, Principia Mathematica, in 1687, a lot of clerics were worried about this. Like, oh my gosh, you've just kind of taken God out of the universe, because now it's this clockwork universe. It's operating by these laws of nature, this thing called gravity that's so highly predictable based on the mathematics that Newton presents in the Principia, and the calculus finds those predictions and so on. You get the predictions of Halley's Comet and so on, right down to the minute, to the second. It's like, where's the room for God? And Newton was a religious man. He said, what are you talking about? This is how God does it. He uses gravity. And so there's no challenge to this. And in his the second edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin addressed the concerns that a lot of religious people had. Does the theory of evolution take God out of nature? And he said, no, why would it? I mean, in the same way that Newton argued against the clerics' concern about taking God out of the universe because of gravity, why can't evolution be God's way of creating life? Now, that isn't the argument Darwin made. He was not a believer, but his wife was a believer, and many believers at the time were perfectly comfortable accepting evolution as God's way of doing it, as are, I should point out, most Christians today accept the theory, including Catholics. 1 billion Catholics accept the theory of evolution is true. They don't find that in the least bit challenging to their religious doctrines. Okay, so in that sense, then we're fine. We have no conflict.